Hey, welcome to the Practically Pastoring Podcast. So excited to be here today. My name is Tim. Today we have a really special guest, Mike Gunn. You may or may not have heard of this guy. Mike is the co-founder of the Antioch Initiative, which is focused on multiplying healthy churches around the world. But before that, he served as the international director of church planting for the Acts 29 network, helping guide and support church planters across the globe. He's been, you name it, pastor, a trainer, a missionary, currently a football coach. He spent decades helping churches think bigger than just their own zip code. We're excited to have him here to talk about the state of the church, missions, church planting. And oh, by the way, he's also been on the show before because he also helped plant a little church out in Seattle with a guy named Mark Driscoll. Don't know if you heard of him or not. So Mike, excited to have you on today.
Great to be here.
We recently did an episode where we talked about how pastors responded after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Mark Driscoll, who you know, went as far to say that if a pastor doesn't talk about Charlie on Sunday, he's a coward and people should leave that church. So when you hear that, what goes through your head? What do you think of that kind of statement?
Yeah, I heard that. I had some people come up to my church and told me about it. I think first of all, it was probably an emotional response that he had. Apparently, Charlie Kirk was a friend. I did see he basically preached on the issue, and he clearly there was emotions involved. So I think part of that is emotions. But I'd say in the long haul, it was unfortunate that this comment was made, that we already have enough division in our churches, and to help divide churches by saying if your pastor is not speaking about a particular social, cultural event, you should leave the church, I think is kind of, it's pretty frustrating in that sense, I think.
All right, Mike, you've got a global perspective of the church that I would say probably most of us here in the States don't have. A lot of times we think of Christianity through a very American lens. So really from your experience, how do Christians overseas view the American church? And maybe what are we getting wrong, and what could we learn from believers around the world?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you hear them talking about, first of all, America in general, America is like the big brother that in some ways they want to be. So they look at politically, and when they see America struggling, they wonder about the future of their own countries, I think. But as far as the American church, I think there's definitely this big brother idea that there's something we want to be like them, and I think it in many ways it's a problem because America has exported some of the worst theology in lots of parts of the world, and particularly prosperity gospel. It's a huge deal overseas. In Africa, I can tell you stories about getting in trouble just mentioning negatively somebody that's a major TV personality. And I think that they aspire, especially in the countries I go to, that many are very poor, to have the worship, to have these large churches, to have the finances to do. There's all these aspirations, but they're aspiring to things in many ways that I think are dangerous. And to a form of American exceptionalism or American ideals that are problematic for their own countries. Many of these are very poor. They live in tough situations from a government point of view. And so there's a sense of almost, it creates a little bit of a jealousy or a bitterness in some ways, because they really want what America has, but America in many ways is exporting something that I don't think is extremely biblical. And so I've often addressed this in many settings and exhorting them to get off the desire for American churches to save them, whether it be financially, whether it be sociologically or theologically, because looking at the way Americans view, I think, the Bible and so on, it is skewed. It is clearly skewed. And yet a lot of the theology they have is from American theologians, or at least Western theologians. They're very big on systematic theology, and so they bring in a lot of Americana into their own culture, which I think is detrimental in many ways to their own culture. And so what I see, particularly with what we can take from them, and it's very humbling in many ways to go there. I mean, to see what they have to go through. Some of the places I go to are very dangerous. They've lost colleagues. I've lost a couple of colleagues in some of these places. I think they have a boldness that's real. It's a gospel boldness that we don't have. I see in some of the poorest countries in the world, they are worshiping in a way that they know that's their only hope. And I think the Christian church has become so individualistic, as well as what it can do for me, that we need hyped worship just to be able to sing to God, where they come in with, instruments that are not tuned very well, drums that have holes in them, sticks that are actually sticks, not drumsticks, and worshiping in ways that it's humbling. I think we can learn a lot from them. The other one is prayer. They only have hope in Christ and prayer, and seeing what they see, I'd say, in many ways miraculously, and spiritually, I think the American church should learn from. Because I think we have a major problem in America right now in what the U.S. American church looks like.
We've had, and I can say I, because I'm in this camp, I've had people bring up Christian nationalism to me, and I think pastors right now, we've had a lot of our own congregation kind of bring this up, and not always by name, right? They don't always know that that's what it's called, but the language and the ideas are there. So from your position of seeing church outside of America, what do you think about the rise of Christian nationalism that we're seeing now, and is it as big of a deal as some people say, and how should we as a local church respond to that?
Yeah, as far as a big deal, I think it is in many ways, because it's a lot of the public persona. So it's what is seen, even if it has a small following. And so I think it is a big deal. And I also see a lot of younger guys that are, coming into the ministry that are very much following some of the bigger names in Christian nationalism or Christian Reconstructionism, which is basically the same thing, different name. And as you said, the name isn't always used, but what I do see is we are in a massive change in America. There's no doubt there. And I think there's a global change. And I think there's a lot of fear. I think the church is operating out of fear. They're operating instead of as Leslie Newbigin talks about, the idea of operating out of liminality, a marginalized area where the church has always done well. And this is one of the problems, one of many problems I have with Christian nationalism, is I do think it operates out of a tribalism, in many ways an anti-gospel. And yet it sounds great because it sounds like we're being bold for the faith, but in reality, it's more of a tribal faith that is connected more to politicking than it is to the gospel. And so when you look at it in an international scene, nationalism, I've probably seen in the last 15, 20 years of traveling overseas, nationalism in general is clearly making it's a rise in the world. You can see this in Russian nationalism. You can see this in Indian nationalism. You can see this in Turkish nationalism. Turkey, where I lived for 3.5 years, it's a secular state. It's become way more Muslim because the leaders there are not only a Muslim party, but they really saw that they can lop on to this nationalistic idea of Turkey as a Muslim state. And it's really changed Turkey, and it's really changed how you do missionary work in Turkey. I've seen this all through the world, where because of there's sort of an earthquake of change in our world, no one knows what to do, so they kind of escape into what they know best or what they feel is going to be the answer to the problems we have in this world. And I think nationalism is one of those things. So nationalism works back because there's a supposed time when there was power, when the church seemed to have power, and trying to grab back on that supposed time that it was a better time. And the question has to be, what was that better time? You can go look back as just 40, 60 years ago with the 60s, in the 70s, of really harsh times with tanks coming into American universities and protest everywhere. This is not new, but there's a new reaction to, I think, what's happening in this world. And I believe the church is operating out of fear, not out of a gospel reaction to what's going on in the world. And I think it's a problem. It's a major problem.
Mike, you were the international director for Acts 29. Now, through the Antioch Initiative, you have a major focus on church planting. Since you've seen a lot of church plants around the world, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice for someone who's about a year out from planting? So think of Frank, right? Frank is about a year out from planting, or anyone else who's listening. So give us your top 3 pieces of advice for someone who's a year out from planting.
Yeah, I think, there's a few. One is, I see a lot of this in planting, and particularly back when I was with national organizations and so on, or at least part of it, is we so emphasize brand, and I think that's a major problem. It's not building your platform. It's not building a brand. It is the mission of the church. And I think guys work so hard and to try to, get everything right with their websites and all kinds of things, which are important in our digital age. But it is not the most important thing. The mission and the contextual aspect of moving into any kind of community, I think, is got to be first and foremost. Like, what is it about that community? Why are you going into that community? What do you know about that community? And what are the salvation mechanisms of that community that you can speak to? And that's a contextualization piece that I think it's not first and foremost. It's like trying to build an identity around that versus bringing in the identity of the gospel. So being missional first and keeping that away from what's basically called mission drift. I think mission drift is one of the problems in any church, but being able to go into a culture, knowing that culture well enough and bringing the gospel to bear onto that culture and the needs of that culture is huge. I think that's major. And speaking to the needs of the community, a lot of church plants don't even really think towards, what are the actual needs of a community? How are we serving a community? We want to build buildings. We want to build all these things and become a larger and larger entity. But God's the one that causes the growth. What are we doing to love and serve a community? How are we going into a community that's extremely maybe diverse? And how are we speak into that community? I think these are some of the things that actually Christian nationalism, in a way, mitigates completely. Wow. Because they're looking at a far more tribal idea of similarity and homogeneous understanding of what the church is and what America is versus what the church is called out to as the nations. And this is my biggest issue with Christian nationalism that works into how do you plant a church. We live in a very diverse time in America, and it's becoming more diverse. And instead of hating the diversity or trying to force the diversity out, why don't we find ways to reach a community that might be extremely different than us? And this is one of my fears in a tribal religion that I think American Christianity is becoming, is we lose the ability to engage anyone that doesn't look exactly like us. Wow. And the irony of it is, in the 1980s, the homogeneous unit principle was the principle of church planting. It was go to people like you. The problem is Jesus did everything to break down those barriers. You can look at Ephesians, that the Jew-Gentile barrier was broken. Galatians 3:28, that's very clear that the barriers between male and female, slave and free, and Jew and Gentile are broken down. That we are now a diversity of people that the gospel is moving out to. And Christian nationalism is a destruction of that gospel element. That's why I do believe it's anti-gospel. If you look at Stephen Wolf's case for Christian nationalism, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about similarity. He's talking about that we go to similar groups. That has a ring of racism and xenophobia to it that I think is extremely problematic. So if I'm planning a church, how can I also break down barriers? How do I engage that culture with the truth of the gospel? And how do I bring gospel reality to that, which is in your preaching and everything else? And the last thing I'd really say is when you look at Acts 14, 21 through 23, you see summarize a pattern that Paul had in church planning. And that was not creating a Sunday service or not getting a building, but to preach the gospel, gather those together and strengthen them, verse 22, and then leaving elders to plant a church. And I think that idea of church planting is lost on a lot of church planners, that we actually go in to a community and preach the gospel and speak to that community in ways that draws people to the gospel, not to shows, not to the great children's programs or everything else that we use for church planting. It's always been the deal since I've been a church planner is you have dynamic speaker, great music program, and a great children's program will plant churches. That's true, but that's pragmatics. Paul went about it by preaching the gospel, sometimes getting his butt kicked, bringing those that cared and brought in and discipled and strengthened them, Acts 14:22, and then trained and left elders. And I think the idea of preaching the gospel, discipling your people, and training men to lead churches is imperative for church plants. And unfortunately, we go for other things that are shinier, but are super pragmatic. And I think the idea of pragmatic church planning, while it often works, has I think been seen now in the long run to be wanting. It's become a major problem. We have so many large church pastors that have failed, including one just saw get sentenced this week. And there's reasons for that, because we've planted on platforms that weren't necessarily biblical. They just were, they worked because of the dynamic, charismatic nature of the people that planted it.
Yeah. I think every church wants to be faithful to the Great Commission. But when budgets are tight, and you've seen this, we've seen this, missions, often the first thing that gets cut. On top of that, missions can sometimes feel overwhelming because there are a lot of options out there. So if you're thinking like a small church, let's say you're talking to a small church, they don't have a clear missions philosophy just yet, where should they start?
Well, I would start in a theology of missions in the Bible, the philosophy of ministry. That's where I'd start. But, David Bosch is a missiologist. I think he's a South African missiologist. Was struck down pretty early in life, I believe. But he wrote a book called Transforming Mission. And in there, he's got a quote that I use all the time, that the church doesn't have a missions program. The church is God's missions program to the world. And to me, this is the heart of what the church is about. God's whole program for missions is the church. And yet we've had churches that create missions program because they've gone away from missions. The drift has been to other attractional things versus the church being seen as God's program for the world. And I think that's where the problem lies. They don't have a very robust theology of mission and a philosophy of ministry. And I think a lot of guys don't put time into that because it doesn't seem pragmatic. It doesn't. It seems like there's other things that cause attractional, support, and we want attraction. And as Mark Devers says, we need to be attractional, but the attraction needs to be the gospel. It needs to be Christ. It can't be the things that we put forth to attract people, because as Devers has said, what you win them with is what you need to hold them with. And so you become a slave to your constituency. And this is one of the things I do teach is kind of a bell curve of churches that we know for a fact that church plants in the first about 7 years do the most evangelism they're ever going to do, because it's a lifeline. They have to do it. Once the constituency gets big enough, in a sense, the tail starts wagging the dog. And so we need to create more robust discipling, as well as recognizing the church is the mechanism for the gospel, and to not stop doing one thing to do another thing and create programs around it. The program is the gospel. The program is the mission of the church. But at the same time, we're discipling. At the same time, we're training. And I think we get off in mission drift by so many things that we do that we lose sense of mission. So my advice to any small church was first recognize that they're called to the mission and realize that has a here, near, and far effect. I'm taking that from our own church. But one of the things when I was early in Acts 29, and when I was trying to do things on an international basis, I got a lot of pushback. And the pushback was the early church planting movement that I think blossomed in the 90s, that Mark was very much a part of and did some great things there. That movement was a movement away from the idea of international missions and bringing the mission back to America because they could see that America was becoming very pagan. I have no problem with that. We are called to be planting churches on a regular basis. But the movement away from the international, I think, was highly problematic. And I'd hear things like, well, it's imperialistic. It's, until you have an indigenous guy. I was working with one major church planting network in Turkey, and they were looking for the guy. They finding the indigenous guy. And I told him, I said, look, there's parts of the world that I go to that there is no indigenous guy. We are called to go. I can tell you parts of the world, who are you going to find? And in Turkey, you would find the 10 indigenous guys that have more work to do than anyone that I've ever seen, because everybody needs that indigenous guy. We need to go in and preach the gospel. And that includes what we're doing locally, but also globally. I'm trying to think his name's Bob, whatever, wrote a book called Global Church. I always love that idea. The church needs to be global. And I think a lot of churches, and it goes back to, again, this idea that the church is about individuals and the church is about what I get out of it. And so it's all about what's going on in that church at that time. We don't think on the realm of, look at Acts 13, when the Antioch church sends their 2 best guys out. That's, to me, is amazing. And so I've sent some best guys out. You possibly want to be doing that with one of your best guys, Frank.
Agreed.
It's hard to send your best guys.
Yep.
But if you are truly global and you truly have a kingdom idea of what it means to be a kingdom church, then you send your best people to do what God's called them to do. And at the same time, take care of your people that are in your church. It's not a neglect of one for another. It's understanding that we are on mission, but we are also local in that mission. And I think it's creating the systems of discipleship that I believe the church has lost for the larger show that's attractional. And this is I'd say one of the bigger problems in the American church is we've created the big show. We do phenomenal job there. And that's what my friends in overseas want that. But the problem is it's created also other problems that the church has that has mitigated the mission of God, including, I'd say, the international mission. So if we can have a philosophy of ministry that says from day one, we are about the local mission, but we are going to care, whether it starts with prayer or adopting one missionary or sending. One of the things I'm really about is when you begin to train people for ministry, one of the things I tell people all the time, don't train them just to do church ministry. Train them in what the gospel calls us to in Scripture. And you'll start seeing what was trying to think his name. He started Fuller Theological Seminary, is Ralph Winters. Talks about the sodality and modality of the church. Some people are called elsewhere.
Yeah.
Paul is not a pastor of a church. Paul was apostolic. we have people in our church that are apostolic, and what do we do with them? Shut up and run the children's program. It's like, that's basically what we do. Run our program so we can get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Wow.
Versus in our training, we go, oh my gosh, this guy needs to be sent. This guy's a church planner. This guy would be great running our children's program. And you see that when you begin to be rubbing shoulders with your people in training and discipleship. And I think we need to have a mentality right away, a DNA that says we are about this church and what God has for us in this mission. And that includes, I started the second church with a guy that was awesome. And I'd still say he's awesome. And in a couple of years, he was a young guy. A couple of years, he really felt called to plant. And he wanted to plant in Chicago. That wasn't in Seattle. And I was like, okay. He's a young guy. I said, can you give me another year? And we'll hook you up. And so training, we brought in another elder, a young guy that was willing to go with him and his family and train them up so they could be trained and ready to go in that year. And at the same time, he'd give me one more year of service. And they went and planted a church in Chicago. And was it hard? Of course it was. It was my best guy. I lose my best guy, but it was a kingdom approach knowing that God had called him to that. If I held him there and he would have stayed, he would have been a frustrated young guy that under an older pastor that just wants him there because he's attractional to some people. And I think we have to have a mentality from day one, a DNA of Acts 13, that we're willing to let our best people go for the sake of the kingdom. Right away, within our first 6 months, we let 20 people go to a church plant in Tacoma, Washington. You have to be able to do that. And when you're a church plant and let 20 people go, I'll tell you, that is brutal. But you can only do that with a kingdom mentality. If you are about a mentality to just build your church, you can never do those things. And I would say for a young planter that's starting out, begin with the Antioch Church's mentality of the ability to listen to the Holy Spirit and send their best people to plant churches. Because that's the only way churches can plant churches. I know as a part of an organization that does that, but that's hard to do. Churches that plant churches are very difficult to do because you're still trying to build enough people to get your own church going.
Right.
To have that ability to say, I'm training people and some of them are going to leave is tough. But I believe it's what we're called to. I really do. It's something very important.
Mike, this is awesome. As always, we love having you on the show. While we've got you, is there anything you want to plug? How can guys out there help you with the Antioch Initiative? Anything else? You got a microphone. Feel free. Plug away.
I'm probably the worst at this. I've had friends go, man, you're the worst marketing guy ever. I really am. I have a website, and I keep on getting website people going, hey, we can make your website better. I'm like, yeah, I don't.
Yeah, your website kind of sucks.
Yeah, I know it does. I appreciate it. Really, prayer. I've had one of my Kenyan buddies. He goes, "What's going to happen when you get older and all that?" I said, "I have no plan. I don't. I have no follow-up plan. God's called me to do something. I'm doing it. I was a pastor for many years. I did it as a pastor for many years, and then now I'm doing it more fully. That's what I was called to do. And I just tell guys to do what they're called to do. Prayer is a major thing, and I appreciate it. I would pray for the worldwide church, certainly for the U.S. church too. Pray for the guys I work with. I have had a couple colleagues killed by radicals. I've been in situations that are pretty rough for my pastors. It's very humbling when you meet a pastor and he asks you, how many times have you been arrested and beaten? And my answer is none. That's a hard thing, and it's humbling to realize these guys are in, talk about Christian nationalism. We're all in fear because people make fun of us, or whatever. That's the big hostility in Christian hostility in America, where I've got friends that are under the gun on a regular basis. And I'd say, look, connect with these guys. That's what you can do. Whether it's my guys, if you want to, I can connect you with them, or connect with guys that are in some of these situations. They are in dire need of financial support, but more than that, I think it's one of the greatest things for a pastor to go overseas to get a broader understanding. So I'd advise that. But if you need anything from me, please contact me. I have plenty of guys I can connect you to. But the prayer for those guys is huge. The stuff that they have to go through is tough. And one of the biggest prayers is, especially in a Muslim culture, and that's where a majority of mine are, but not all, is they tend to, a lot of the pastors in those areas tend to operate within the Christians in those areas. It's very difficult to engage the Muslims for obvious reasons. I pray for boldness for them, pray for safety. It's hard for me to go over there and say, you need to be bold, and I go back to America, At the same time, they are called to that. They are called to boldness, just like we would be. And so, I would just plug that. You have brothers and sisters. I work, by the way, now this is my last thing I'll say, and this is interesting. I don't want to get into the politics of this. I got very interested in the whole Gaza thing and the Israel and all that stuff because I work with Palestinians. And I work with incredible Palestinian Christians. I mean, great guys. They're in the thick of it. They get hammered from both sides, okay? Their culture doesn't accept them because they're Christian, but then they got the whole thing of the Palestinian and the Jewish. I mean, it's a bad situation. And one of the things, I want to plug this. My friends, a couple of them have been to the White House to report on the Palestinian situation. I've been able to interview them. I've been able to be with them. They've written an open letter to pastors in America, and I just want to state that open letter. And the open letter is, please pray for us, because we're getting our butts kicked, and no one cares.
Wow.
Because they care about certain things. Christianity in America cares about certain things, but they don't realize that we got brothers and sisters dying in the Sudan, in Yemen, in Syria. Right now, Syria is a brutal situation. I operate in that area. Palestinian Christians are being killed as we speak, okay? You've got to understand that as you get onto your global pulpit and say the things you want to say. They have no idea why prominent Christians are going over and signing bombs, basically saying, go kill the enemy. When the enemy is our brothers and sisters in Christ, some of them are. I know there's a lot of politics behind that. I do. And it's convoluted, believe me. I am hoping to put out my own podcast regarding this pretty soon. But please pray for them. Yeah. Please realize that in Gaza, we have brothers and sisters being killed by both sides, by the way. Wow. Okay? And so that's my biggest plug, is recognizing that we have so many brothers and sisters that are being persecuted for real. And so if y'all Christian nationalists want to get on board that. Because it's all you're fearing is someone calling you names right now. I've got brothers and sisters that are dying. So please pray for them.
Thanks, Mike. Hey, if you're out there watching, listening, and you are not part of our Facebook group, we'd love for you to be on there. We'd love to get to know you, to pray for you. You can ask questions, and we'll address them right here on the show. But hey, thanks for joining us, Mike. Thank you for being here,
Yeah,
and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Take care.
See ya.